Good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Regina Yao, founder and president of the Pixel Project, and I'm moderating the 13th and final Google Hangout session of the 5th fall edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. Through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 15 award-winning best-selling authors to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for the Pixel Project to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking, as well as help us reveal the first mystery celebrity male role model portrait in our celebrity male role model Pixel Reveal campaign. So we'll be telling you more about the Read for Pixels fundraiser, which has lots and lots and lots of exclusive author goodies a little later in this session. And you can find out more about the Pixel Project and also how to stop violence against women by visiting www.thepixelproject.net. Now we have a very special guest today. We're going to have a live discussion and Q&A session with science fiction and fantasy author David D. Levine. David is the author of Andre Norton award-winning novel Arabella of Mars from Tor, which came out from Tor in 2016. The sequel Arabella and the Battle of Venus, also from Tor 2017. And over 50 science fiction and fantasy stories. The third book in the Arabella of Mars series is just out, and David will be showing the book to you very soon. His story, Tick, 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 won the Hugo, and he has been shortlisted for awards, including the Hugo, Nebula, Campbell, and Sturgeon Awards. Stories have appeared in Asimov's Analog, F and SF, Tor.com, numerous years' best anthologies, and his award-winning collection, Space Magic. Now, David has also generously donated some goodies to the stash of author perks that we have up as rewards for donors at the Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. And I'm going to put David on screen because he has a little show and tell. Hi, David.
Hi.
Okay. So David has one Arabella and the Traitor of Mars book signed and personalized. Now, this is the first edition hardcover. Is it a first printing as well? It must be.
I think there's only been one printing so far, so yes.
Yeah, okay. And you're also offering a 30-minute Skype chat for an individual or a group. Yes? So if you're a big fan of David's, you can donate to get this. Or if you are a librarian or a teacher or a leader of a writing group or a reading club, reading circle, donate to get this. David, we can tell you for sure that David will keep you entertained, and you guys can talk about everything from books to writing to what's happening right now in the news, which is infuriating to a lot of people. But yeah, so you can talk about anything, life, the number 42, anything. And if you are aspiring author, or if you are an author in progress, David has also very kindly donated a chance for you to get the first chapter of your work in progress critiqued by him. He'll do a written critique, so you actually have it on hand. He'll email it to you, and this perk is inclusive of 2 follow-up emails. So you can send David another 2 emails, have a very short conversation with him if you have any questions about his critique. And that is actually really important because he's not just handing you a critique, he's gonna try and explain stuff, and if you have any other questions, he will answer it. Now, the signed and personalized book is for US donors only. And the Skype chat and written critique are for donors worldwide. And there's only one of every treat, and each one has a modest donation request attached to it. So fulfill the donation request today, and David will get going with sending you the goodies. And please give generously. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women, including this program right here, Read for Pixels, where we are attempting to show people the importance of stories and how stories affect culture and therefore affect how things are going to change for women and girls. And if you are watching this session on YouTube right now, you will also be able to ask David questions live. Just make sure you're logged into your YouTube account. So you can type in your questions into the chat box to the right of the YouTube screen. It's just next to it. And Kathleen, who's today's producer and chat box moderator, will relay them to me to read out to David to answer. And now let's go over to David, who is going to start today's reading.
Oh, okay. Am I on? Great. Hiya. So yes, here I am. I'm David Levine. I'm live from Portland, Oregon. And would you like me to begin by reading from my work, or do you have any opening questions?
No, let's begin with the reading.
Okay. So I will set myself a timer so I don't go over time.
This is awesome. You're the first author we've hosted who has a timer.
Okay, so I'm going to be reading from my third book, Arabella, the Traitor of Mars. This takes place in a universe that is where the physical laws are different from this one. In this universe, space is full of air. And so in the 16 and 1700s, the European powers have colonized Mars and Venus. So this takes place during the English Regency, about 1820, when Arabella, who was originally born on Mars, but dragged back to England by her mother because her mother feared that she was turning into a wild child, dragged her back to England in order to civilize her. It didn't. And so when she discovered that her brother was in jeopardy back on Mars, she dressed as a boy and joined the crew of an interplanetary freighter in order to get back to Mars in time to save him. And that was book one. In book two, Arabella and the Battle of Venus, she becomes involved with the Napoleonic Wars. And I suppose it's a spoiler, but at the end of Arabella and the Battle of Venus, in the titular Battle of Venus, Napoleon is defeated. And so as book three, Arabella, the Traitor of Mars, opens, Arabella and her husband, Captain Singh, find themselves back on Earth, where they're hailed as conquering heroes. And so she and her husband get invited to the home of the Prince Regent, which, if you're familiar with the Brighton Pavilion, in our universe, the Brighton Pavilion in England was built by the Prince Regent in the 1800s. And is Chinese on the outside and, is Indian on the outside and Chinese on the inside. Well, in this timeline, it's Venusian on the inside and Martian on the outside. So I'm going to begin. Arabella is stuck in the Brighton Pavilion with the Prince Regent and all of his entourage. They've been stuck in by a snowstorm for some weeks. And so she's been passing the time by inventing the bicycle, which is called the Dracaine. And there's a lot of historical detail woven in here. The bicycle actually was invented right around this time, but I have Arabella adapting the pedal mechanism, which is used to pedal the airships between planets, adapting pedals to the Dracaine to invent the pedal bicycle about a decade ahead of when it was invented in our timeline. So Arabella is just coming back from the stables where she's been working on the Dracaine, and she runs into the prince, who uses a steam-powered wheelchair. Upon returning to the main pavilion, its surfeit of counterfeit viennoiserie, its glaring gas lamps, and its suffocating heat, even more oppressive to her after her clean, exhilarating flight on the Dracaine, before she could ascend the stairs to her bedchamber, she was met by none other than the prince. "Ah, there you are," he said, as his conveyance chugged up to her. "I was told you had gone to the stables. I was just going thence to meet with you." Unusually, he was alone, lacking the crowd of sycophants and hangers-on who generally accompanied him. "I am in no fit state to meet with the prince, your royal highness," she said, managing to gesture to her soiled dress and execute a tolerable curtsy at the same time. "Pish, pish," he replied, gesturing negligently. "We're all friends here. Come, I must have a word with you." He puttered off down the long gallery, forcing Arabella to walk at a brisk pace to keep up with him. Her thighs immediately reminded her that they had just recently undergone an unusual exertion and did not enjoy being called upon for this additional task so soon. The prince led her to an anteroom she had not visited before and shut the door behind her. Her heart hammered at the sudden isolation, not so much because she feared impropriety as because she had no idea what the Prince Regent might ask of her, and as he was her acting sovereign, she knew that she could not deny him any request. "Pray, take a seat," the prince said. Arabella did so, recognizing even as she did that this was not only a generous offer of comfort, but also brought her down to the prince's level, negating her advantage of height. This regards your husband as well as yourself. He paused, tapping his fingertips together. How old are you, if I may ask? 20, Your Royal Highness. Again, he waved away the honorific. As I thought, exactly the same age as my daughter, the Princess Caroline. You remind me of her in so many ways. She too is headstrong and irrepressible, though at least unlike you, she has never run away to Mars, ha. Indeed, she has not, Arabella temporized. It is perhaps because of this resemblance, the prince continued, in addition to your heroism and great service to the empire, that I feel very kindly toward you. And so I wish to grant you and your husband a great boon. A boon, sir? Arabella's heart pounded still harder. The prince sat back in his chair, looking down his nose and across his steepled fingertips with what she imagined he thought was a benevolent expression. Now that Bonaparte has been most definitively defeated, England finds herself the sole decisive power in the entire solar system. But other nations, and not only human nations, will soon attempt to fill the spaces vacated by the great tyrant, like rats moving in after the dog has chased the cat away. I have been approached by a coalition of men from the Admiralty and the Honorable Mars Company, who intend to take the battle to these rats before they can attain a foothold. What has this to do with me? Mars! The prince shouted, striking the arm of his chair with his closed fist. Will be the chief fields in this coming war. Did you know that St. George's Land comprises less than 7% of its surface area? 7%! The entire remainder of the planet belongs to those filthy Martians. Arabella pressed her lips together, rather than angrily correcting His Royal Highness on the topic of Martians, as was her first impulse. It was their planet, after all, and the English colony merely a guest thereon. If her mentor, Lady Corey, were here, she would certainly advise Arabella that to contradict the Prince Regent in his own home on a topic clearly dear to his heart would be both impolite and impolitic. Mars is the only source of this special wood of which our aerial ships are constructed, he continued, lecturing her upon a topic with which she was intimately familiar. And Martian steel is the finest in the solar system. England must control Mars for the sake of her future. But surely with Napoleon's defeat, England no longer has any significant rivals in this. The Martians themselves, my dear, he said, as though addressing an ignorant child. They are our rivals. You may think them primitives, as she did not by any means, but they are warlike and ambitious, and some of them are most exceedingly shrewd. And now that we have dealt with Bonaparte, we can devote our full energies to bringing them to heel. But why, Your Highness? We have traded with the Martians quite amicably for generations. Surely there is no need for this to change. They have been content to leave the defense of their planet from Napoleon and such like warlords to us. And now that that threat has been removed, they may feel free to move against us. It is only by dint of treaties and lack of expertise that they lack aerial ships of their own. And we cannot rely upon this situation to continue if we do not take measures to enforce it. Your argument makes no sense. No difference, Your Highness. She had about to say no sense. The Martians have no ambitions to empire. Nor have I, child, nor have I. But I am assured by both the Admiralty and the Honorable Mars Company that the possibility, indeed the likelihood, exists. Furthermore, the profits to be realized from English dominance of Mars are well nigh incalculable. The Prince Regent delivered that last sentence in an offhand manner, but the expression on his face as he uttered the word profits showed that it was more significant to him than he let on. The effect was subtle, but suddenly she suspected that she understood the real purpose of the Prince, the Mars Company, and perhaps even the Admiralty in this scheme, and she was horrified. Her first impulse was to rise, spit in his face, and stride from the room. But she must confirm her suspicions. Recalling the words of Lady Hertford regarding the prince's sense of self-importance, she leaned forward and smeared a smile across her face. Oh, but Prinny, you have so much money already. Surely mere profit is of no significance to you. Ah, that is where you are wrong, my dear, he replied with a matching smile, causing her to wonder just how sincere any of his previous smiles had been. I am, in fact, most grievously constrained by Parliament. Grievously. My position, my responsibilities, they absolutely require me to furnish myself and my household in accordance with my station. But given the paltry pittance provided me by my father, with the collusion of Parliament, I have been forced to borrow the necessary funds, to such an extent that I am now burdened with a truly mountainous debt. But with the assistance of my friend in the Mars Company, who, in exchange for my help in this matter, are prepared to share with me a portion of the funds realized, I will be able to discharge this debt and return my full attentions to the grandeur and glorification of England. Which brings me to my original point. This scheme absolutely requires a man to lead it, a very particular kind of man. And with your Captain Singh's long experience in the Mars Company, and with his demonstrated and quite innovative military mind, he is the very man for the job. But for some reason, he seems reluctant to accept the position, despite the many emoluments we have offered. And so I approach you with this additional enticement. If your husband agrees to participate in this scheme and it is successful, I shall create him first Duke of Mars, and you his Duchess. He smiled benevolently. You have your Prince Regent's word on this. I think I have to stop there.
That is, oops, I think I'm echoing. Am I echoing?
Not to me.
Okay. So, Arabella, headstrong, irrepressible, and utter delight. I loved reading her adventures. You know, it's kind of like reading about stuff that your mom never let you do.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're a girl. Girls don't climb trees. Girls don't go off on adventures. You know, and you know your books and stories feature fantastic female protagonists, Arabella. And they are complex and they are full of agency. So who or what are your inspirations for your female characters?
I don't think Arabella is based on anybody in particular, but I do have something that I refer to as the principle of protagonistiness. Protagonistiness is the quality of being the protagonist, the quality of taking action in order to move yourself toward your goals. And I try to be more protagonistic in I try to give my main characters that characteristic of taking action, or at least trying to take action. And that's what makes people sympathetic. And that's how real people actually make progress. And so I could say that I've kind of modeled her on myself to the extent that all of my characters are facets of myself. But she's not based on anybody in particular, but she is the person that I wish that I would be in her situation. Also, Arabella is, there's no question that she is not representative of the typical female person of her time and place. This is Jane Austen. This is Patrick O'Brian timeline. And most women were extremely limited in what they were allowed to do. I wanted to have a main character, and I wanted to have her be able to step out of her accustomed roles. Well, step out of the role, the box into which her society would like to put her. And so I made her that wild child. I made her a frontier girl who was brought up almost as much by Martians as she was by her family. So this gave her, honestly, 20th century attitudes. And so it permits me to, in universe, have her be more headstrong and more active than I think most women of her age and station and time and place would have been able to get away with. So this is a place where the world building enables the kind of character that I really wanted to write about.
Yeah, and it's to many people though, and this is something that some female authors, Read for Pixels authors, have brought up. To people, female protagonists, some readers have a very fixed idea of what a female protagonist should be. They should be feminine, they should adhere to female stereotypes no matter how strong. I'm doing this air quotes now that they are, and Arabella, as we were talking about just now, she definitely defies the whole sugar and spice and all things nice stereotype of a rebellion against gendered norms. And her mom tries to straitjacket her. That didn't quite work, and she turns tropes on her heads by coming to the rescue of the men in her life, such as her brother. And do you as a male author get any flack for not portraying your female characters as feminine and good and uplifting?
I have not gotten any pushback from anybody about having an active female character who takes action and has agency. I have not gotten any pushback on that. One of the reactions I have gotten, one of the negative reactions, and this is, I'll have to say it's a valid point, is that Arabella becomes a strong character, and I'm using the term strong here to mean well drawn rather than particularly burly. Arabella becomes a strong female character by virtue of stepping away from the things that make her female, by acting like a man, and that some of the readers have said, I wish that she would be strong and active and have agency and still do girl things, and not, because by having her be active and protagonisty, by stepping away from being a girl in her time and place and acting more like a man of that time and place, in some ways this chooses to reinforce the gender binary rather than upending it. And I have to take this as a fair critique. But it's, there's a lot of, it's a very conventional book in a lot of ways. I mean, it was written as YA. I'm trying to address the problems of sexism and colonialism and racism of the period while still producing a conventionally structured adventure yarn. And so there are some places where I think the conventional structure overpowered some of the things that I wanted to do with, in terms of portraying ideas that I wanted to portray. And every book is a balancing act. And this is how this one came out. And it is absolutely up to the readers how they react to it. I did the best I could. I'll take the critiques and try to improve my work going forward.
Yeah, but it on the flip side, the readers who've sent you that critique, aren't they also reading Arabella from a point of view that is formed by gendered norms, that certain things are feminine, certain actions are feminine, and certain actions are masculine? Because I read it and I thought, I've known girls like that. My sisters are Arabella. You can't lock her in a room. When she was a kid, she used to climb out of the window, much to my mother's consternation. But it is, there was never a time, I think, when there weren't women and girls who were very active for Arabella, who could climb, who were very physical, who could climb, and who had their own ideas. It's just that we don't hear about them a lot. We're only starting to hear about them now. Their voices are silence in history. I mean, Mary Robin at Kowal was talking about this because she writes alternate history, a fantasy set in an alternate Regency history as well. And she's like, maybe people aren't thinking about the fact that women like, her characters, and also I'm thinking that Arabella did exist in that time. They did climb regardless of whether they had their long skirts on. They did do stuff that boys do.
Yeah, and I chose to have Arabella cross dress as part of that adventure, part of that breaking out of the mold, climbing out of the box. I made a point of having Arabella cross dress significantly in every book. Whereas I think that Mary Robinette's heroines are acting more in the female role. I think they do sometimes cross dress, and they definitely have adventures and take action and have agency and do the protagonist thing. But I think that Robinette's characters are more Jane Austen heroines, whereas Arabella is more of a Patrick O'Brian heroine who happens to have been born a girl. And I think there's room for both kinds of these. In some ways, I think that Mary Robinette's stories are actually more true to the period. I think that she's done more research, and she has a much better understanding of the Regency than I do. But we all have our views of the past, and we use it. We authors use the past in different ways. So, you know, I mean, the books are different, but I think they're all valid in different ways.
Yeah, and you know what, women cross-dressing, that's really Shakespearean.
Mm-hmm. And actually, in book 2, the cross-dressing takes place in a performance of Twelfth Night.
So yeah, I mean, women have been cross-dressing, you know, since way before Regency. It's the Regency period as well. If you look at, have you come across the website Rejected Princesses?
Yes.
There were so many women who cross-dress, who had to dress as men in order to do the things that they want to do, be doctors, go on adventures. So you know, that's why Arabella is great. You know, I hope more women and girls read them, because you know, more young women and girls in school read them, because Arabella is fantastic fun, and shows that you can do, you know, you can go on adventures as a girl. You can be yourself. You know, she's a little bit like Anne of Green Gables. You know, I read Anne when I was growing up. And Arabella is a little bit like Anne, because it shows young readers that it's okay to be yourself. It's okay to be active. It's okay to have your own thoughts. It's okay to express your thoughts. It's okay to have a temper. That was Anne. You know, no matter what society tells you, it is okay to be yourself. And you know, you mentioned that Arabella's written, you know, her books are written as young adult, and you know, they're in the last 10 years, I think. There's been an influx of more capable and strong female characters in young adult fantasy. And I think on Tumblr, they call it the Hermione effect. And what are your thoughts on this? And did this influence the way you created Arabella?
Hermione did not specifically influence me, although I certainly agree with those who claim that Hermione is actually the hero of the Harry Potter books, because she is generally the one who takes action. Harry Potter is the front man, but Hermione is the one who's actually figuring out what's going on and taking most of the important. I mean, basically, if you have Hermione and the guy who wielded the sword at the end, you know, the guy who actually did the
chopping. Neville Longbottom?
Yeah, Neville. If you had Hermione and Neville, Harry is just the front man. You know, he's the face of the conspiracy, but he's not necessarily the actual hero. I mean, Harry looks like a nerd with the glasses and the scar, but he's really a jock. His primary role at Hogwarts is he's not an exceptional student. His main exceptional talent is in Quidditch. So, you know, there's a lot of picking apart that can be done about Harry Potter, but it's so much fun that we have to excuse that, and it's brought so many people into the field. But Hermione is, I think, a great role model for people in general, not just girls. Because Hermione, so there's this thing with the primary and secondary houses, that if you look at the main characters, they're all in-house Gryffindor, but Harry is really kind of Slytherin-ish for a Gryffindor, and Ron is very Hufflepuffish, and Hermione is very Ravenclaw-ish. So I think I'm a Ravenclaw, and I'm a Ravenclaw primary, Ravenclaw secondary. So I'm Ravenclaw all the way down, and I am very happy with the idea that Hermione is really the protagonist of the stories, because brains are where it's at, as far as I'm concerned.
So you know, we talked a bit about Harry. So let's talk about writing women.
Mhm.
So in the past, we've had male Read for Pixels authors talk about how they found it difficult to write female characters. I mean, even Brandon Sanderson, who just took part in Read for Pixels at the start of September, talked about having to consciously work on breaking out of writing women as stereotypes. So, why do you find it comfortable? I mean, when we read the Arabella books, it seems like you're very comfortable writing interesting female protagonists. Why do you find it comfortable? Not many male authors. I mean, the one of those who do is very comfortable is Jay Kristoff. We just had him a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying that he keeps getting asked. I don't know if you keep getting asked the same question, but he keeps getting asked by guys why all his protagonists in all his books are women.
Mhm.
So, I mean, why do you find it? Do you find it comfortable? Because you sound comfortable when you.
I find it quite comfortable. I mean, honestly, all my really close friends are women. And a lot of my role models are women. A lot of my favorite authors are women. But really, you're probably familiar with the statement that feminism is the radical idea that women are people.
Mhm.
That's how I write my female characters. I write them as people. I write all of my characters as people, and they're not all people. I've got a lot of. I mean, I think of myself as writing more than half of my main characters as female, but just like that thing about if it's more than 15% of the people, if more than 15% of the people speaking up in a crowd are female, everybody, both men and women, thinks that it's about equal. That I think last time I totaled it up, I think my number of female protagonists in short stories was something in the vicinity of 40%, so less than half. And then probably 10 or 20% were non-humans, albeit many of the non-human protagonists also have gender. So I'd have to count. I counted the non-human protagonists with female gender as women, and it was still less than half. So I haven't managed to achieve equality on that. But here is a thing. Here is the primary reason that Arabella is female, is because drama comes from having characters that you care about be in trouble. Okay. And the harder their job, the more sympathetic they are. So I choose female protagonists because it's harder, because it is harder for them to achieve their goals by having to overcome their gender as well as any other uh, obstacles that I, as their creator, can put in their way. And so having the main character be female, especially in a universe like Arabella's, which has sexism baked into it at a very deep level, having Arabella be female is just a way of making her life harder, which makes her a more interesting, more sympathetic, more relatable protagonist. So it's kind of a when you become a writer, you stop being able to read and watch movies for pleasure in quite the same way because you can see the strings. Okay, so I'm exposing some of the strings here. Is that I made Arabella female not only because I wanted to have a good role model for my female readers, which is definitely one of my motivations, but the primary, well, maybe not the primary, but the first motivation for making her female was just to make her life harder. And there's an awful lot of female main characters going all the way back through history who I think are better protagonists, more relatable, more sympathetic protagonists, just because their gender gives them disadvantages in their society.
Yeah, and so following up from that, what tips and suggestions can you share with male authors who want to do the same thing, who want to be able to write female protagonists well, but are still finding it difficult or tricky to break out of writing women as stereotypes?
Okay. Well, my primary advice is, again, write your characters as people. And really you've got to be able to put yourself into the shoes of all of your characters, at least all of them, the major characters, especially the villains. The villain has to have understandable motivations and understandable thought processes if they're going to be convincing as a villain. But you need to be able to put yourself in the character's shoes and think, what would I do in this situation? And don't think, what would a woman do in this situation? What would a person do in this situation? Also, if you're having trouble creating relatable female characters, try relating to some actual females. I find that my understanding of what life is like as a woman comes from listening to the women in my life, reading my female friends' social media, and really seeing what they have to say. Sometimes it's surprising. Like right now in the last week, the number of my friends who have come out and saying, yes, I've been sexually assaulted. I've been harassed. I've been the victim of sexual violence. It's appalling. And a lot of us guys don't appreciate just how big a part of life that is, if you happen to be female in this society, is the fear and the constant focus, the awareness that you have to have of your situation, because this kind of stuff could jump out at you from any direction. And you know, I did not shy away from helping my female partners with things like period protection. I'm being I mean, I don't mind using these words, but this is YouTube, and so I'm going to be a little bit more discreet than I would be in personal conversation. But I don't have any problems dealing with those girl things because I like women. Most of my best friends are women. I spend a lot of time with women. I'm intimate with women, and that is part of their lives. And if I'm going to be a part of their lives, then I'm going to be part of that too. And it's just like cooking or cleaning up. You know, dealing with the realities of being female is something that women have to do, and I think men really owe it to themselves to have some understanding of.
Yeah, because we're half of the world.
Yeah, more than half. Yeah.
51%, but you know, I would say subtract a couple of percent or more. I'm not sure about the percentages, but there are non-binary people out there as well. So
yeah, I think more male babies are born, but women live longer, so it averages out to a little bit more in the way of women. Although these days we're becoming more and more aware of just how many people do not quite fit into the gender binary. So if we really counted people who are on the gender spectrum somewhere other than just binary male and female, I think we'd come up with some different statistics. But that's going to be changing over the next century. I think our understanding of gender is changing rapidly, and by this time next century, we won't just be talking about men and women, and we'll be talking about the whole gender spectrum and where people fit along it, and how people change over the duration of their lives as well.
Yeah, and you know, speaking of rising women, Arabella's stories and books definitely passed the Bechdel test. I mean, there's this discussion that I was in a forum with writers and other readers, where you know, I actually nearly lost my temper with some of the male contributors to that discussion and said that, oh, come on, women have a million more things to discuss than men. So why is it so difficult for male authors, or you know, to write, you know, to write women talking about, you know, some male authors to write about women talking about anything other than a man, because we talk about a lot of other things in real life. Women do. And you know, what would you know, why do you think many science fiction and fantasy authors still have trouble writing stories that pass the Bechdel test? And what can you suggest of writers who want to write female conversations realistically?
Okay, so why do so many science fiction and fantasy books fail to pass the Bechdel test? The answer to this, as is the answer to so many questions, is because sexism, because it's baked into our society, and we've all been soaking in it since before we were born. And very many of us, no matter what gender we may be, have been so deeply exposed to this that getting away from it is extremely difficult. It takes work. Like, for example, one thing that I noticed when I started writing the Arabella books, and I'm writing in a deliberately Regency kind of mode of speech, I found that it was comfortable. It was like slipping into a warm bath to be able to use phrases like every man for himself. All men are created equal. Everyone should have everyone to his own way. That this sexism that's baked into the language is something that I usually have to work to avoid. And I usually do work very hard to avoid. But writing in an 18th century argot, I was able to not stop and think and find another way of formulating it. And it was easy. And that easiness is a warning. That comfort is a warning. It shows that we do need to keep working in order to avoid the unconscious sexism that can very easily slip into our characters. So one thing, a piece of advice that I have when creating character, like if you want to pass the Bechdel test, get some goddamn female characters in there. I mean, the standard anime 5-person team of 4 guys and the girl. Okay, you need to have more than one of any underrepresented class of people. You need to have, if you have your whole cast is white and you just have one person of color, well, that person of color is going to have to represent all people of color, which means that person, if you have that person have any foibles, or if they are the villain, then that means that you're saying that all people of color are villains, or all people of color are less than in some way. But if you have several characters of color, then they can represent different aspects of the experience of people of color. And they can, and so you can have 1 or 2 who are perhaps not perfect. If you have several women, then you can have them talking to each other about things, maybe even things other than men. But if you only have 1 female character, then you're not going to pass the Bechdel test because there's nobody for her to talk to. So when you are inventing characters, stop and question your initial assumptions. If your barkeep, if 2 characters are having a conversation in a bar and the barkeep interrupts them, does the barkeep have to be a man? Does the main character have to be trying to live up to the manly things that his father did? Why can't the main character be trying to live up the ideals that his mother held up for him? Why can't the boss? Why can't the general? Why can't the president be female? Or be female, be a person of color? It's not realistic to have. It may be realistic to have all of your characters be women and people of color. It absolutely may be realistic, but that'll kick some of your readers out of the story. But it is also unrealistic to have all of your characters be white men, unless you're writing in certain periods of history. And even then, even if you were writing if you're writing about the British Navy, there were women on British Navy ships in the Napoleonic Wars. There were people, and not just wives and prostitutes, and not even just wives and prostitutes and women dressed as men. There were women serving right along men, and there were people of color all over these, all over history. That women and people of color have always existed, even in the whitest spaces, and they've been erased, or they've been ignored, or they were put down at the time. But they were there, and they played their roles in that society. And you've got to do your research and find out about them, because you can continue to ignore them, but that isn't realistic either.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that people have started complaining about is, if you show, say, London in the 17th century, or London in the 16th century, but where are all the people of color? London has always been cosmopolitan. Yes. London has always had a very busy, harbor. The Thames is a major dock, major harbor. So much trade going through London. Yeah. And where are all the people of color?
Yeah, and if you do your historical research, if you go to the primary sources, you go to primary sources and you go to the most recent research. Because if you're reading books from the 50s, you're only going to get the white male experience. But more recently written histories are going to be more aware of the women and people of color who have been erased in the past. And the thing is, they were there. And the more research I've done, the more I realize the degree to which they were there and the degree to which they had significant roles to play. And we've been ignoring that as a society for far too long, and we can't be allowed to keep doing that. It's lazy.
So let's talk about we talked about female characters. So let's talk about male characters. So, as with your female characters, you portray a wide range of male characters in your novels and stories. Though there are misogynistic characters in your books and storylines featuring violence against women, there are also male characters such as Arabella's late father. He's the sort of dad that I'm like, yeah, that's great. And Captain Singh, who are respectful of women, their thoughts and decisions. Now, do you think reframing how stories describe men away from hostile and toxic stereotypes and towards complexity and even vulnerability can be one of the ways science fiction and fantasy writers can break away from toxic tropes that promote toxic masculinity and the dehumanization of women?
Well, the short answer is yes. I mean, yes, obviously writing characters who do not exemplify toxic masculinity is a way to help educate people to the fact that there are alternatives to toxic masculinity. Also, showing the negative consequences of toxic masculinity. I mean, one way to help change the world is to show a world without whatever, without toxic masculinity, without sexism, without whatever you're trying to avoid. But that can be utopian and perhaps not a satisfying story because it's too message heavy or because there's not enough drama in it. But if you portray the violence, the toxic masculinity, the sexism, the misogyny, if you portray these things and you portray the negative consequences, and you portray them in such a way that the reader can identify with characters who are opposed to these toxic masculine things, then that I think is a way to help educate people that there are ways other than those ways, other than there's those easy stereotypical if you keep doing what you did, you'll keep getting what you got. Okay, if you keep going along with the standard tropes of toxic masculinity, then you'll have all the negative consequences of toxic masculinity, which include both violence against women and also forms of violence against men. Toxic masculinity is toxic even to the people who carry it. Because if you're a man and you have fully adopted the ideas of toxic masculinity, this is actually harming you in ways you may not be able to identify. They are interfering with your relationships with all the people around you, men and women. They are making your life more stressful than it has to be. They're driving you into an early grave. Toxic masculinity causes heart problems. Toxic masculinity causes people to die in fights, to be shot, to die in accidents that would have been avoidable, to get into arguments that jeopardize their lives and their careers, to take drugs. Toxic masculinity causes alcoholism because it's a way that is self-medicating depression and anxiety with alcohol is a treatment which is acceptable within the toxic masculine culture. But it's bad for you. It has all kinds of negative side effects that reduce your quality of life and shorten your life, and destroy your relationships with the people you love. And if you get over your toxic masculinity and accept that you're anxious and depressed and find other ways of dealing with it, other than the societally approved ways of getting drunk and beating people up, then you'll have a happier and longer life. So toxic masculinity, it's not just a problem for women, it's a problem for all people.
Yeah, and we just saw a prime example of alcoholic toxic masculinity at the Senate hearings this week.
Yeah. I don't think, if you take a clear-eyed look at Kavanaugh and what he is like as a person, he has been harmed by this. I mean, yes, he's got money and power, no question about that, but his psyche is damaged. And if he were a better person, he would realize just how weak and angry and under the control of his worst nature he is. He could be a better person if he could just stop being such an asshole.
Oh,
I mean, it may be too late for him.
Yeah. Okay, we're gonna have to put a little sign up going, this video has strong language.
I'm sorry. I tried.
Yeah,
What
but
the forking sheet?
no, I mean, we would have teachers. We probably would have teachers and parents watching and using this to talk to kids. But it's okay. We do have authors with strong language because it's calling a spade a spade, and we would put a little. I mean, YouTube allows us to put a little sign there on the video saying there is strong language, so it's okay.
Well, this is live, so it's too late for that.
Yeah, it's recorded as well, so anyone after this would have a heads up. So do you think this violent toxic alpha male type character that we see in so many books, do you think it will phase out of science fiction and fantasy as cultures worldwide start changing and no longer accepting toxic masculinity? Or do you think it's one of those stereotypes that would stick around for much longer than expected?
Yes and yes. I mean, we're already seeing that the science fiction characters are becoming much more rounded. Both male and female characters, and increasingly characters of other genders, are much more rounded, much more sympathetic, much I'm going to use the word softer, which is not really accurate, but softer so the characters of the 1950s reading books written in the 2000s, if the characters of then could read the books of today, they would say these people are soft. They would say this is not how a man behaves. And by the standards of those characters, which are not necessarily the standards of the day, but certainly a kind of way that characters used to be, I think that characters are more nuanced, more psychologically attuned, more willing to see the gray areas and not just the black and white. I think that our writing is better. There's a great book called Everything Bad is Good for You, which talks about how plots and characters are becoming more and more sophisticated as the decades go on, because people are more sophisticated consumers of entertainment. You look at Dragnet versus Hill Street Blues versus The Wire, in terms of like the number of different characters, number of different plot lines, number of words per minute, just the complexity and sophistication of plots on a purely technical level is growing decade by decade. And I think the sophistication of characters in terms of what they are capable of doing and feeling is all. The characters are, they're not the melodramatic, pure black-hatted villains and white-hatted heroes of the 1950s, or the even more black-hatted, mustache-twirling villains of the 1800s. I think that characters are getting subtler and more sophisticated as time goes on. The average. I mean, obviously Shakespeare was capable of creating some amazingly sophisticated characters 400 years ago, but still, I think the average quality of writing and the quality of characters in popular entertainment is going up and up as time goes on. So I think we've already gone a long way of getting away from toxic masculinity. That being said, the stereotypes are still there. There still are people who are writing characters like that. There's still plenty of people who enjoy reading characters like that. And I think it's not necessarily something that we even want to completely eliminate, because I try to eat healthy, but I don't want to completely eliminate potato chips and donuts from my diet. I want to read about interesting, sophisticated, nuanced characters, which is not to say that there is no place for Biff Brannigan in my reading diet. And I mean even a non-ironic Biff Brannigan character, because there are people like that. There are unsophisticated people like that, and sometimes they're even the hero. There are some people who are just amazingly pure, and they are incredibly masculine without the toxicity. And so I think there is room in our fiction for these old-fashioned models, because there are still real people who are like that. One of the innovations of the movie Blade Runner in 78, I think it was, 78, 79, was that Blade Runner portrayed a universe, well, Blade Runner and Star Wars both portrayed a universe in which the old things were still around. Up until then, science fiction had all been shiny and new. You know, you look at the spaceships from um, Star Trek series, and everything in them is shiny and new. Compare that with Blade Runner. So, well, compare that with Star Wars, where lots of stuff is crufty and old, and then even more sophisticated in Blade Runner, where you've got stuff that is old stuff with new stuff glued onto it. You know, Deckard's car in Blade Runner he's got an old car with like a new air conditioner bolted onto the roof. That it's a used universe that you can see bits of today buried under the Los Angeles of 2019. And I think that is a more sophisticated, more accurate view of what the world is like. We do not completely replace things. Los Angeles is not completely replaced with the Jetsons city of dome bubbles and flying cars. Los Angeles of 2019 is accreted on top of the Los Angeles of 2000, which is accreted on top of the Los Angeles of 1950, and so on and so on and so on, back to the founding of the city. And science fiction is like that too. Our characters are built on the stereotypes of previous generations. And so that stuff is always going to be there, but we can examine it. We can hold it up to the light and think about what these characters mean, rather than just accepting them as the only way for male and female characters to be.
Mm-hmm. And you know, oftentimes the line between consent, I mean, this is related to the whole alpha male thing. You know, the line between consent and coercion isn't always very clear in fantasy books, whether it's epic fantasy, urban fantasy, or paranormal romance. I mean, do you think this is an issue that writers in the genre have started tackling successfully in recent years?
We've got a ways to go on that one. I have some very strong opinions about consent, and I think that as a society, we've done a terrible job of educating our young people about consent, and we are only within the past, God, it feels like only the past 5-10 years have we really started talking, especially to young men, about what consent really means. It isn't this legalistic thing of having to get a signed release before you can kiss somebody. I mean, you can absolutely do consent in a way that's very sexy and, dare I say, consensual. That if everybody involved in a sexual situation is a truly willing participant who goes into it with their eyes open and doesn't do anything unless they really want to, it's a lot sexier and a lot more fun. And I wish that we could go back and unteach all of the terrible lessons that all of us have learned. I think that kids who are being born right now will have an opportunity to grow up with a much more sophisticated idea of consent than any of us who had the misfortune of being born in the past did. But I think our fiction has not done a great job of representing consent. I think that 50 Shades of Grey is a terrible model of how to do BDSM. It is a...
the BDSM community was and still is up in arms. You know, yes. That is because they are built on consent. The BDSM community is completely built on consent.
Yeah. So, so 50 Shades is not about BDSM, it's about coercion. It's about an unhealthy form of. There's a difference between hitting somebody who wants to be hit, or shall we say, spanking somebody who wants to be spanked, and hitting somebody who does not want to be hit. And if you coerce somebody into saying, yes, I wanted that, or yes, I do want that, that is not the same as truly obtaining their consent. And I wish that we could bake this into our society rather than thinking of this as a legalistic thing that has to be plastered on. But it's going to take many, many years before the average person has a good understanding of that. And I think our fiction could be doing a better job than it is of portraying good consent, or in cases where a fictional situation involves lack of consent, that can be portrayed more accurately as well, because lack of consent is absolutely a thing that happens. You know, people get people get assaulted and beat up and murdered and raped in fiction. And that is a thing that happens, and it does not involve consent. But what we need to show is to show the consequences of that lack of consent and help people understand what they can and should be doing and what happens if they don't. And that, I think, is one of the things that fiction can change.
Yeah, and coincidentally, there's just a discussion yesterday happening in one of the women's groups I'm in, and we were going, God, sometimes you read, boys are not taught to accept no as an answer, and they will keep the best case scenario is they will keep badgering you and badgering you and badgering you. The worst case scenario is they take out a knife or a gun and they kill you.
Mm-hmm.
And and when we read fiction, a lot of fiction still shows that it is very romantic, or it is absolutely the right thing to do for the male character to keep badgering and badgering and badgering. And yeah.
The thing I talk about protagonistiness. Protagonistiness is the quality of continuing to take action despite obstacles, right? Yeah. So if the female character is considered to be an object, and I mean object both in the sense of being an inanimate thing, and also object in terms of being an objective, something which is sought, and also object in terms of being a grammatical object, which is to say the thing which is acted upon. If you consider the female character to be nothing more than a target, a goal to be obtained, then for the male character to be persistent in that, despite her objections, is him being a protagonist. And we need to get away from that. We need to consider the female characters in our stories to be not objects but people. If we look at this, if we look at flirting as being a game that should be fun for both parties, then that kind of thing just stops happening. If everybody involved understands that everybody involved is a person with goals and priorities and lives of their own, then you won't get people who keep badgering, because they will understand that the person they're badgering they will be aware of the fact that the person being badgered does not like being badgered and will stop badgering. But we're a long, long way from being able to do that as a society. We can have our individual characters do it. And I think it's interesting to show the contrast between characters who do and characters who don't. But I think the admirable characters are the ones who do.
So, stories, we were talking about this before we've gone on air today. And stories are one of the most powerful ways of bringing about change. And in the Arabella series, you very deftly and pointedly, this is what I liked about it. You very deftly and pointedly take pot shots at the patriarchy and its effects on women and girls without compromising the rollicking pace of Arabella's adventures. So what advice would you give authors looking to strike a balance in their storytelling between raising awareness about violence against women while telling an engaging story without being pedantic or preachy?
Well, this really comes down to show versus tell, that I think a lot of the and show versus tell is a more complicated thing than it looks like, because we talk about you should always show versus tell, but it's not the case that you should always show versus tell. You need to, in general, tend to prefer showing over telling, but there's an awful lot of stuff that is really better off told. And in the same way, you need to, if you put in too much exposition, if you put in too much explaining about the universe rather than having the characters live in the universe and by living in the universe demonstrate the rules, demonstrate the magic system or the technology or what have you, then if you just stop the action and talk to the reader about how the universe is, then that's an expository lump and it's no fun. You can put in the exact same amount of information in different ways and it becomes fun. Okay, so putting in message can also be done in a way that you stop the action. You write a story which is all about the message and is not an entertaining story because the message becomes a thing that is told. If you instead show the message, if you actually portray the characters doing things that are either things that you want to encourage or things that you want to discourage, and show the negative or positive consequences of those things, then this is a way of getting the message across in a way that still makes an entertaining story. And it's got to be, you've got to think about the story first. The story has to be an entertaining story first and foremost, or you won't sell it. You won't sell it to the editor, you won't sell it to the readers, and you won't sell it in the sense of selling an idea, that you won't get the idea across if you're preachy about it. But if you show interesting characters confronting these difficult problems in interesting ways, then people will like the story. And so I always say that writing is more like acting than it is like directing. So get into your characters' heads, really feel what it is that they feel, and understand that some of your characters are downtrodden, are non-privileged, are disadvantaged in some way, whether it's because they're female, because they're people of color, because they have disabilities, because they're from other cultures, because they don't speak the language, whatever. If you put yourself in that character's head and really feel the problems that their society is putting onto them, then that character will, I think, perforce become an interesting protagonist. Because if you identify with that character and you really make that character want to get away from those problems, then if you are sympathetic with your character, then I think your character will be sympathetic to the reader. So confront the problems through the characters and not writing about the message.
Yeah, it makes sense. And there's the other extreme where writers just lazily use tropes like fridging women and using violence against women as a shock tactic, or they use it to give the male protagonist a reason to go off on his quest. That kind of, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and doing anything in fiction that has been done 1,000 times before is lazy. And if you find yourself, I think that I say that tropes have gravity. If you get a trope, it'll tend to try and pull you in. So you have to thrust against it. You have to push yourself away from the trope, or you're just going to fall into it. So when you find yourself doing something that is the same as other people have done, whether in terms of a character or in terms of a bit of plot or a bit of setting, stop, think, come up with a different way. Just as I said, does the bartender have to be a man? Do the main characters have to be, do your adventurers have to meet in a bar before the adventure? Why can't they run into each other at the fair at a weenie roast? Why can't they run into each other at a quilting bee? What if the inciting incident takes place in a more traditionally female environment? Why does it have to start in a bar? Why does it have to start with fighting? Think about different ways of doing things, and your work will be more interesting and more engaging, as well as more diverse and more true to life.
What would be interesting would be if the whole sort of adventure thing started in a knitting group where they're both men and women knitting.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are men who knit.
Yeah.
There are men who knit. People keep thinking knitting groups are all women. Actually, there are plenty of men who knit.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, do you think, this is probably very obvious, but do you think it's important for influential authors such as yourself, who are read by people all over the world, to make a conscious effort to include character, to write stories that show readers the importance of respecting women as equals and as human beings?
Well, I think it's important, yes. The fact is, you will probably wind up having characters who don't, because you have to have some nasty people. Well, you don't have to have nasty people, but I think stories are more interesting if not all the characters are lawful good. But so not all of your characters have to be woke, but it's interesting if you show the consequences both to the characters themselves and to the world around them of their ignorance and bad attitudes and negative behaviors. People will have negative behaviors, but your story will be more interesting, more relatable, and more true to life if you show the negative consequences rather than, I mean, it's like violence. That I mean, violence is kind of a symptom of toxic masculinity, and there's a huge difference between showing people punching each other and then just dusting themselves off, and showing somebody getting hit in the jaw and actually carrying that bruise for the next couple of days, and actually like having difficulty eating and being in pain, and you know, living with the consequences of violence. And that's, you know, that's the difference between, I think you know, that's the difference between realistic fiction and unrealistic tropey fiction. Is unrealistic tropey fiction is full of bashing and violence. More realistic, more nuanced fiction shows the violence, but also shows the consequences of violence, and actually showing the blood and the guts and the death may get you, you know, if you do it on television, you may find yourself with an adults only rating. But it's more true to understand what life is really like and why we don't go around hitting each other, because it's bad, because of the consequences.
Yeah. And you know, let's talk about geek culture. We're going to wrap up pretty soon. So let's talk about geek culture. So geek culture in general, including science fiction and fantasy, has had its share of critics saying that it's still too male-dominated, despite a rising number of prominent, well-respected, and well-known female authors and creators. Plus, there is still plenty of hostile, misogynist, and sexist behavior by male geeks towards female geeks. What do you think needs to be done to make geek culture as a whole, whether it's comics or gaming or books, more welcoming for women and girls?
I strongly suspect. I mean, I was just at a Comic-Con. I was just at a Comic-Con the other day, and it seems like just about everybody I talked to was female. There's so many great cosplayers, so many really enthusiastic fans. I mean, there are so many women in fandom. There have always been women in fandom, and sometimes I think that fandom is mostly women. And if the men would just shut up, we'd realize this. I don't think that's really true. I think probably comics fandom and comics fandom may be more men than women, but I think there are many more women who read comics than will show up at the conventions. A lot of this has to do with economic disadvantage, and a lot of it has to do with toxic masculinity, because the women who enjoy reading comics recognize that they don't need to put themselves in those situations because it'll be unpleasant. But you know, what is necessary to get toxic masculinity out of comics? You know, comics, science fiction used to be this little tiny corner of real society, and these days science fiction, comics, superhero movies, science fiction movies, fantasy movies, fantasy books. I mean, the Harry Potter books and the Terry Pratchett Discworld books are among the biggest sellers, period. Science fiction and fantasy have taken over the real world, and the downside of this is that the real world has also taken over science fiction and fantasy. So the sexism and the toxic masculinity and the misogyny and the economic inequality of the real world is part of the geek culture as well. So I think if you want to try and fix toxic masculinity in geek culture, you kind of have to fix toxic masculinity in culture, period. Although I suppose those of us who are in the culture have a little bit more power over the culture, over the geek culture, than we do over culture in general. And those of us who are in a position to, for example, figure out who's going to be on panels at conventions can make a distinct effort to get more women and more people of color up in the front of the room. We can be inviting both. We can seek out underrepresented populations. We can explicitly invite women and people of color to our events, to contribute to our websites, to our blogs. If we happen to be editors or publishers, invite them to contribute to our works. That there are things that a lot of us can do, and even if you're just a reader, if people saying, "Hey, what are you reading?" Stop, think, and maybe consider, can I represent something by a creator of color or a female creator rather than the same old men that I've been reading for all this time? I try to do that myself. I always will. I mean, I read books by men and by women, and books by white people and by people of color. But when asked for recommendations, I try to at least think first of what have I read recently that's really good by women and people of color. And I'll absolutely recommend books that are not, but I at least make the effort to recommend at least something by people from underrepresented populations. And that's how we change the world.
Yeah, and you know, it's still a thing in fantasy groups on Facebook. I don't know how many groups you're in, but every time someone in a book group goes, in a science fiction fantasy book group goes, I finished reading XYZ. I'm looking for something new to read. Can you all, you know, recommend something from this particular corner of fantasy or this particular corner of science fiction, especially fantasy? And everyone would just trot out the same 10 white men. And then if you say something about, hey, what about women? What about people of color? What about this author, that author? You get piled on.
Yeah. And yeah, but the more people like me do stuff, the more people like me recommend works by women and people of color, you know, that if you are a reader, if you are a white male science fiction reader, you should be reading works by women and people of color, because many of them are very good, and because it broadens your experience, and because you may encounter something that is different and unlike anything you've read before in a very cool and interesting way. Reach out for them, read them, recommend them. And this is how we change the culture, is one reader at a time, talking to other readers about, hey, I read this cool thing. That's how we change the culture.
Yeah, do that instead of running around shouting and calling everyone else SJWs.
I think people who use social justice as an imprecation may be beyond help. But I think the way to deal with people like that is to talk to the vast don't care very much middle, because
Yeah.
they're going to be annoyed partisans on both ends of the political spectrum, but there's a big middle that doesn't really care about any of this. And if we can appeal to them, if we can show that, hey, you know, we're not humorless message fiction, we're actually writing cool stuff that might be different from what you read before, then that's the way that we can get more of that uninterested middle over in our direction, if not on our side. It's a long haul. It's a long haul.
I
And
mean, that's
cultural change is like turning the Titanic, as you said.
yeah, I mean, this is what the Pixel Project does. You know, it's a nonprofit. We basically we're aiming for the middle, the big mass of people in the middle. You know, because we realize that we aren't gonna change the minds of unrepentant misogynists. You know, we aren't gonna change the minds of all those old white men sitting in positions of power, because they're not going to let go of it without a fight. But what we can do is we can reach out, we can do stuff like Read for Pixels, like so many of our campaigns. We can do stuff that, you know, everybody can take part in, that no one is going to shame you or no one is going to lecture you for it. You know, join us, take part, you know, take a picture of you and your pet, hold up a sign. That's easy. You know,
We're having fun here, people.
we're having fun here. Wear purple. Put your dog in. Well, okay, guys, if you're listening to this, I'm just going to tell you that we are going into Domestic Violence Awareness Month in October. And every year, the Pixel Project hosts a photo statement campaign called People and Pets Say No. And People and Pets Say No came about because a lot of women and children can't leave their homes, can't flee their abuser because they can't take their pets with them, because a lot of shelters just aren't equipped to also accommodate fur babies. So they stay behind. And also, one of the biggest red flags that a man is going to be abusive is when he is a teenager and he kills and maims animals. So we came out with People and Pets Say No, and it's a fun way of, it's a way of getting people to do something, of encouraging, not getting people to do something, but encouraging people to think about it. When you run around chasing your cat with your sign and trying to take a picture, after you've done that and you've written this words, we say no, and put your name to it, that you are staking at least that much, that you yourself, with your name out there, is saying no to domestic violence.
And that's how we change the world.
Yeah, and you start thinking, or the people around you start thinking, and that's how you start changing. That's how you start thinking about things, and maybe rethinking how you think about domestic violence survivors, how you think about, maybe you might not ever say again, why didn't she leave? Maybe you might not say again, well, she must have done something to make him mad. So one person at a time, from the middle, not the unrepentant misogynist, though. So we are coming up to the end. So I'm going to ask you the last question, which is what we ask all our authors. It's a Captain Obvious question, but bear with me. You have been so incredibly supportive of our Read for Pixels campaign and our anti-violence against women work as a whole. So why do you support the cause to end violence against women, and what do you think authors can do to help with the cultural change needed to eradicate violence against women and girls?
Well, I mean, we've been talking about that for the last 2 hours. So what can authors do to help stop violence against women?
To help with the cultural change, and what do you support? Yeah,
I think writing relatable characters who demonstrate the consequences of positive and negative attitudes toward women, and really showing the consequences to everyone of violence against women in fiction is probably the best way I can think of. That it's like, if you can, when you write fiction, you put yourself, you project your thoughts into another person's head, right? It's kind of a form of forceful telepathy. So when you write fiction, you create a character, you create an entire world, and you get that reader to think right along with that character. You put that character's thoughts into that person's head. And if you can convince that character that violence against women is a bad thing, then maybe, just maybe, you can have an effect on the reader. But it has to be done in a way that's entertaining. Because if you just tell people, don't do this, then they'll rightly say this is message fiction and they won't be interested in it. So you write a good story with relatable action-filled protagonists to demonstrate the consequences of doing the right thing and doing the wrong thing. And it will help people to understand vicariously why to do the right thing. I think that's the best advice I can offer.
Yeah, and there are studies that show that fiction encourages empathy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When you read fiction, the same areas of the brain light up as when you're interacting with people. The mirror neurons that help us feel the emotions of people that we're talking to are also activated by reading fiction.
Yeah. So okay, so what I'm going to do is put myself back on screen. So, guys, thank you so much for being with us today. And as mentioned at the beginning of the session, David has very generously donated some treats to the stash of author goodies that we have up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels Rally Out fundraising page. Now, I'm going to put a little slide up on screen. Can you see that?
I can see it.
Okay, so David has donated one Arabella and the Traitor of Mars first edition hardcover signed and personalized for one US donor, one 30-minute Skype chat for an individual group, and one written critique of one chapter inclusive of 2 follow-up emails to answer questions. There's only one of every treat, and everyone has a modest donation request attached to it. So fulfill the donation request today, and David will send you the book if you're in the US, and we'll set up the time for the Skype chat and the written critique if you get those. So on this slide is the link to the fundraising page. So it's is.gd/R4P Rally App 2018. This is case sensitive, so make sure to hit the caps lock when you need to. And you can find out more about the Read for Pixels program, what we are doing all the year round with authors at is.gd/readforpixels. And you know, if you want a smaller, like some of you might want a smaller goodie or another book, or you might want something that's like a knitted goodie. Like some authors, David, actually they do hand knitted stuff. It's amazing. You know, there are more author goodies available from authors including Lee Bardugo, Peter V. Brett, Karen Rose, Adrian Tchaikovsky, Elliot de Bodard, Susan Dennett, and more. And so please give generously. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. And if you want to find out more about stopping violence against women, you can go to www.thepixelproject.net. And to find out more about the Celebrity Male Role Model Pixel Reveal campaign, please visit reveal.thepixelproject.net to learn more about it. And help us reveal pixels by donating and reveal our first male role model, who is one of the most famous Nobel laureates in the world. And I'm going to put David back on screen. David, do you have any announcements that you want to make? Anything you're attending for the rest of the year?
Yeah, well, I'll be at Oricon in Oregon, in Portland, Oregon, in November. I'll be at World Fantasy Convention in Baltimore, and the day before that, I'll be reading at Charm City Spec in Baltimore. That's open to the public. That's at the end of October. You can always find out, go to my website, which is daviddlevine.com, and click on About Me, and then under there's an upcoming appearances. And I do have a lot, I travel a lot, I go to a lot of conventions, I do a lot of readings, and so you can check there. Or if you'd like to be informed of my travels, you can sign up for my newsletter. And I promise I will not spam you. I only send out a newsletter like about once or twice a year. So yeah, no, I'm not hard to find. David D, just Google on David D. Levine. If you throw in that middle initial there, you'll find me.
Yeah, and so we're gonna say good night or good day to everybody wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us today again. And we hope to see you next March. Oh, yes, I'm going to put David on.
This is my new book, Arabella, the Traitor of Mars, the third and final book in the Arabella of Mars trilogy.
Yeah, and you can have it signed and personalized if you make the donation and if you're in the US. So good night, everybody, and we'll see you next March. That's when the next Read for Pixels campaign is up.
Thank you very much.
Good night, everyone.